other board members. So bear with us on the technology. We're going to do our best with this, but we have a host of school leaders in the back of the room who will be engaging in the conversation as well. But I'm not going to take any time here, and I want to turn it over to Dr. Wiles, who is the face on the screen for you. So Dr. Wiles, you are on.
All right, thank you, Dr. Singleton. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our community conversation on the 2018-2019 school budget. First, let me thank Dr. Singleton for the wonders of technology so that I could be with all of you tonight from Nashville, where I am at a conference. So in the next hour, we're going to try to do two things. First, I want to spend a little time reviewing the results from the community survey that we completed at the beginning of this month. So you can see what community members felt about some of the ideas and priorities that we presented via that survey. That should only take 10 or 12 minutes. The rest of our time will be an opportunity for people in our audience today to ask questions about the actual proposals that were posted to our website last week. These are detailed ideas of things that we are considering. They have not yet been put into the budget, but that we are considering. And you'll have the balance of the hour to ask questions of the administrative leaders who are together tonight, so you can get some insight into those issues. So that is a full hour, I think. So I'm going to, without any further ado, turn things over to the survey, the priorities survey results. And what you will see on the large screen shortly, if not already, is the PowerPoint presentation. And I will talk through the findings, and Dr. Singleton will be advancing the slides for me. So I guess without further ado, why don't we switch over to the PowerPoint, Damien, and I'll walk through it.
You're all set.
Okay, perfect. So let me start with who responded to this survey. We had a tremendous response to the survey. Last year we did a similar survey. We had about 1,100 respondents. This year we had 1,346 total respondents in the 2 or so weeks that the survey was open. And among the groups of people who responded, there were 1,163 school district residents, 595 parents with currently enrolled students. We had 379 Guilderland High School students who responded, and then 341 district employees. And you can see some of the characteristics of those employees. There is overlap among these groups. So if you're doing the math to try to make these add up to 1,346, it doesn't work, because we have people who are employees and parents and residents and all different combinations. So don't make yourself crazy trying to do the math. But thank you to all those individuals who took the time to complete our survey. So Damon, you can advance the slide. The next slide is this. We had 18 different categories that we asked people to rate, from essential and critical to our mission, which is what you see on the screen, all the way down to, on a scale of 4, not all that important, particularly when resources are tight. So what you see on this slide are the top elements from the large group. So these aren't disaggregated in any way. This is among all respondents. What were the items that people felt the most strongly about as being critical to our mission? And you can see very first one with 61%, that ongoing concern about having safe, secure buildings where we have our children and our staff. That was, for the second year in a row, the most significant issue, followed by academic supports for struggling students, and then safe, efficient transportation. And then you can see the progression of the items. I won't read them to you, down to support for ENL. I did want to mention some of the items that people still think are important, but that did not make this kind of top list. Other things that were included in our survey had to do with enrichment, acceleration, expanded electives at the high school, support for athletics, support for professional development, co-curricular clubs, and support for personnel and financial management. So those didn't make the most important list, but I wanted to just give you a sense of what the other categories were that we asked people about. If you move on to the next slide, you can see the responses for two groups, residents and parents. And I suppose it's not surprising, but the top 4 budget priorities for both of these groups are identical. Little bit difference in percentages, but maintaining safe and secure buildings was at the top of the list, followed not far behind by maintaining safe, efficient transportation. And then the next two just flip-flopped in the priority order from residents to parents, but support for students' social and emotional growth and support for academic support for struggling students were both very important. So a lot of consistency, which is good. And when we see this kind of consistency, it helps us as we're thinking about those difficult decisions we need to make when we get into the actual first draft of the budget. So if you move on to the next slide, we look at students and employees. And again, at the top of the list for students, maintaining safe, secure buildings comes in as 64%. This is identical to their parents. Last year, you might remember on this survey, that result for students was 78%, and it caused us quite a bit of conversation to try to figure out why that number was so high. Clearly, it's still important, but it doesn't seem to be quite as pressing as it was when we did the survey last year. Also for students, maintaining safe, efficient transportation, academic support for struggling students, and then support for students with disabilities is high on their list. And then if you take a look at employees, a little bit different priorities here. Academic supports for struggling students comes in at the very top. Class sizes, smaller class sizes is next. Support for students' social emotional growth, and then maintaining safe and secure buildings. I thought what was interesting about these 4 categories is 3 items showed up in all 4 groups: safe and secure buildings, safe and efficient transportation, and academic supports for struggling students. 3 of the 4 indicated that the social and emotional well-being of our students is a priority. And only 1 group mentioned class size, and 1 group mentioned support for students with disabilities. So overall, quite a bit of consensus when we look at these very top priorities. So we also asked our respondents to consider the financial challenge that is before us. It's one thing to know what our priorities are, but then how do we go about paying for them? And we know, at least at this point in the budget development process, we have a $1.6 million gap between our anticipated expenses based on the rollover budget and the revenue available to us. So we asked our community members how we should close the gap. And if the first graph is there, you can see the overall combined respondents. We had a little over 20% said we should use fund balance to close the gap. A little over 40% said we should reduce spending. A little under 20% suggested that we challenge the tax cap. And then the last group, the smallest group, was other. And I'll share with you that most of the others' comments said, can you use a combination of fund balance and reducing spending, which makes a lot of sense. We also disaggregated the data a little bit. And Damien, if you can hit the next button, you should have a chart come at the bottom of that page, and you'll see how residents, employees, parents, and students took slightly different perspectives on how we should close the gap. A couple surprising things. The group with the strongest feelings toward reducing spending was parents. I would not have expected that. The group most interested in looking at fund balance was our employees. They were the least interested in reducing spending. So different variations in a theme of how we manage this gap in revenue. And I won't, I don't think, spoil this surprise, but of course we're going to look at a combination of ways to solve this problem this year. So I'm going to move on. One of the other questions that we asked our community had to do with the Cobblestone Schoolhouse. You'll recall last year we had quite a bit of conversation about the discussion of investing money in repairing the Cobblestone Schoolhouse. There were a couple items last year that we had to take action on because the integrity of the building was clearly jeopardized. But it raised a lot of issues about what should our long-term plan be for this historic structure. And when you look at the responses, you can see it was overwhelming, with the exception of one group. When we asked the question about whether we should transfer or maintain ownership of the Cobblestone Schoolhouse, that most indicated that we should transfer it. Much fewer said we should maintain it, with the exception of our students, who were much closer in their perception about whether or not we should transfer it or maintain it. So this is some good food for thought for our Board of Education, because we will need to continue to deliberate on what will be the next step for that structure. And then the last thing we asked about was start time. This has been an ongoing conversation over the last several months about the research that has indicated that there are some real benefits to having giving adolescents more opportunity to get their sleep. So the idea is to perhaps have a data. So as you look at this, the way I've interpreted it, I've looked at the bottom three bars to say, so how much of our population are satisfied with what we have currently, or at least neutral? And as you can see, 61% of our total population here who responded seem to be satisfied or at least neutral. Residents, a little bit more. Parents, again, about 62%. Our employees seem to be the most satisfied and or neutral with our current start and end time. But not surprisingly, if you look at the very last category, the column for very satisfied, and neutral is the smallest. It's under 40%. So again, this is food for thought for the board as we consider the extent to which we dive into this and try to study it more and figure out what is the most logical next step for us in Guilderland. So I guess with that, I will say thanks to everybody who responded. And I guess perhaps we should open up this to questions from the board or others before we dive into the next part of the program. Are there any questions?
I would have a question if it was possible.
Go ahead, Barbara.
We had spoken even before the survey went out that when we had the presentation from the Glens Falls superintendent, that an education process has to happen before we would consider changing the school times. Change is hard, but what he stressed is that it is really important to share the benefits. And I think when you just send out a survey like this, most people haven't even been exposed to the research. And so I'm not surprised at the results. Let's just put it that way.
Well, we just getting a start, and there was a link on the page for this question to a lot of the research. It wasn't exhaustive by any stretch. It was a few pages long. So if people wanted to click on it and look at it, they could have. But obviously, there's more work to be done. We just wanted to take the pulse of the community at this early stage.
Thank you.
Are there other questions?
I would have one more if nobody else would.
Go ahead, Barbara.
The students' response to the Cobblestone Schoolhouse was so different from residents and parents and all that. Was there any programming on the part of the staff as to sharing with them the benefits that the staff saw of keeping the schoolhouse? Is that a possibility?
To my knowledge, Barbara, no one did any pre-work or discussion around the Cobblestone Schoolhouse. I think students responded based on what they heard, just like any other resident would have, to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anyone else? Okay. If not, then why don't I ask Damien to move the slides up to the one that says questions and comments on preliminary budget proposals. And I'll take a couple minutes to introduce these 4 categories, and then I will open things up for questions. So we organized these proposals a little bit differently than we have in the past, so that we would get a feel for how we go about closing the gap that we know that we have, but use some detail about the things that are on the table. So the first category are known savings. Are items that came up when we were doing our preliminary budget planning in October, November, December, January. These are items like fuel, energy costs, changes in enrollment for students with disabilities who we know are graduating, and leaving private placements. So these are largely savings that we can be confident will materialize next year. Maybe not 100% confident, but we have good confidence that they will materialize. The category underneath is called identified needs. These are the proposals that came forward as a result of our stage 2 work with our administrative team. And this is where we look at enrollment, we look at student needs for academic support and social emotional needs, and we look at everything. And the longest list, this is the longest list, are all the things that we've identified that, you know, all things being fundable, we would do all of these things. We probably will not be able to do all of these things. So part of this will be clarifying our priorities. The third category is reductions. And I want to be really clear when I say this. These are not items that anyone wants us to take. They are items that made it in a list because the district office gave everyone the task of finding 2% of savings from their budget. We won't need to take all of these, but we wanted to have options to work for. So I would call these the best of not good options if in fact we need to make some reductions. So I want to be really clear that these are not recommendations. These are not things we want to do. But for now, they are under consideration. And then the last, we have just a couple things that when this list went public on February 6th, there were some items out there that we did not have complete information about, not enough to provide information about FTEs or costs, but they're placeholders for now, and hopefully they'll be fleshed out in the next week or so, and we'll be able to determine whether or not they make some sense for the first draft of the budget. So I've talked enough, and at this point, I would like to open up our community conversation to those who might have specific questions about the materials that we shared. Hi, Kim. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good.
Kim Blasiak, Crazy Parent. First question is, do I get to ask every one of my questions at one time, or would you prefer I see if anyone else has questions?
Give us a couple, and then we'll see.
Okay. The first question that I do have, of course, is on the Cobblestone House, only because it says in the proposal that it could be a savings of $35,000. However, back in, was it October or November when you did your presentation, it was $49,050 with the asterisk that this excludes the replacement of wall and ceiling insulation. So I'm just curious as to the discrepancy, because the $35,000 was actually what was paid last year, which was actually more than what was originally put on the table.
Yeah, the $35,000 saving is a budget-to-budget savings, so the inclination here is not to do any additional work on the
Okay.
Cobblestone Schoolhouse, so that budget essentially goes to zero, so we would save the $35,000 that we had current budget into next year. It would go from $35,000 to zero.
Okay.
$35,000
So it
savings.
kind of washes itself out. Okay.
So, I just want to know, because it was stated before that it's like in 1997, so 20 years ago, it was quoted back by that superintendent that it's a burden to the school district because of asbestos, not handicapped accessible, it's a fire hazard, it's a burden to the district, quoted, and of no use. So if we're in like financial problems, why are we even considering this? I mean, I understand that the students have a say, but there's certain students, and we look at this budget, and obviously the needs of the students, especially students with disabilities, are looking at being cut in support staff. When you're looking at $35,000, even though it's a little bit of change, that is a lot of money, where you could be looking at funding other programs. So when you see that, and it's public knowledge, it's written on paper 20 years ago. And how many times have you taken basically the taxpayers had an unlimited home equity line of credit on a house that's unusable, unlimited, that we've paid for 20 years? I think that's pure public knowledge that the taxpayer should have known that it's unusable. So what is your plan? And there's no plan. And I've looked, where's the line item in the budget every year? It's not even listed. Maintenance, it's lump summed. Every year I look, there's gasoline line items, battery line items. Little Cobblestone House, no line item. Pine Bush, everybody, Pine Bush playground is a mess. Bees, kids getting stung. We need a playground. That's not a priority. Problem.
Is it open to everybody?
It's sad.
Marie, are the questions for everybody, or can we ask two, or are we all included? I have a question about something on the table.
You can ask.
Can't you hear me? Marie, can you hear me?
No, I couldn't hear that. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I had a question about the TAs in kindergarten and first. To me, like, I don't understand how that can come in. I know you said under that's in the reductions table as the best of the worst, or the best of the worst case scenarios or whatever. I guess I'm curious as to how that came up, because it seems like that would be when I looked at the table, that stood out to me the most, to get rid of TAs or more support at that level. Because if you look at the other items, they're talking about switching E&L supports to the elementary schools because of the greater need or the greater need there. So I don't understand how taking away the TA time for kindergarten, I feel like it comes up all the time too, and there's a lot of pushback about that. So I don't know. That would be one that just stood out to me as I would not advocate for.
Well, let me just reiterate. No one wants to make that reduction. The challenge for our elementary principals is that they don't have a lot of flexibility when we ask them to find 2% in reduction. So they really didn't have much else to offer. So that particular proposal isn't a complete elimination of TA support. It's a reduction to 2 hours. And, I'll be really clear. That's a last resort. We understand how much our community values the TA support in our primary classrooms. So things will have to be pretty dire for us to end up going there, to be really frank with you. So I totally understand that raises a level of concern.
Can I just say I agree. I don't think it should be on there at all. I'd like to know if there's any place other than.
Folks, can I
Yeah,
ask
go
you
to the
to
microphone, please.
microphone when you have to speak? We're broadcasting on channel.
Is there any place elsewhere in the budget that can make this kind of a cut so that the elementary schools don't have to propose something that nobody wants to do and isn't wise? Is there something in somebody else's budget where this cut can be proposed?
Well, everyone was asked to make 2%. Everybody. So there's a strong likelihood that we won't be taking this cut, but we'll be taking someone else's. But, we made a decision when we put together the list that everybody, every department should be represented, that no one group should not have to put something forward, recognizing that, we will weigh, this isn't the budget that we're talking about tonight. These are simply ideas for consideration given the financial circumstances that we're in.
Could I ask a question? Maureen, there seems to be a lot of questions about the kindergarten. So, and you had said earlier that there is not a lot of discretion when it comes to the elementary principals. So maybe, so everybody could have a better understanding of what they do have, could you kind of lay out some of the items that they would consider that are controllable that they could look at to get their 2%? So everybody could kind of understand the magnitude and what they have to look at or what they don't have to look at?
Elementary buildings, it's sections and staffing connected to those numbers of sections for special areas. Then we get to materials, supplies, equipment, which are very small dollars. The library. There's just not a lot of places to go at the elementary level. So, or unless we start looking at class sizes, and I absolutely understand that no one wants to do that. So that there's just not a lot of flexibility in the elementary programming to look for areas where they could make reductions. So
would it be fair to say that the only place they can really look is the personnel at their building, because that is the only thing that they really have direct control, because it's the class sizes and or the TAs or the support staff that are in those classes?
I think essentially yes. Their materials and supplies are very small in terms of the proportion of the budget that they fill. There's things, there's textbooks, but those aren't lines that we necessarily want to reduce, because those are line items that generate aid. So if we don't purchase those, we end up getting less aid to support our work. So there just are not a lot of options other than people.
Hi, I have a couple of questions. My name is Carrie Deneen, and I teach at Pine Bush Elementary. And as far as what we're just talking about now, I wasn't thinking of talking on that, but I think over the years we've talked about how it would be great if we could look at K12 priorities because of this issue where the elementary principals don't have co-curriculars, they don't have anywhere to cut. And I understand trying to keep it even. I totally do saying, all right, each department give up a percentage, but I think in the long run, when you know that there's nothing at that level to do that except for taking support from kids, we need to look more at what's the priority K-12 all the way up and down. Aside from that comment, I think I have a couple questions for Mr. Sanders, possibly. Is the 1.6 shortfall that we're talking about for programs based on the taxes that we realize now? Like based on what you have on the books right now?
Correct. Well, it's an assumption of revenues and
Yep.
expenses and the tax.
That we know
cap.
about. So there's always somewhat of an increase between probably November and, well, you probably have some of them on, but now to the end of the summer that we might have between a hotel going up, we have houses that are built all the time and things expanding that we take in a little bit more in the end.
In terms of tax revenue.
It's
yes.
tax revenue, yes, we do. And our general fund now is at a decent amount that exceeds the 4.5% the controller recommends.
No, we're below the 4% maximum for unrestricted fund balance.
I thought we had like 7.7.
Not with we have money in reserve funds and we have money in fund balance. And by law, that can't exceed 4%. We're about 3.9%.
Okay, but overall we have, okay. That's why I was curious about that and how that worked that way. All right, because I was reading that differently, so I wanted to know. Because I just think that we need a combination of sorts because we have taxed, when we had surpluses a few years ago, 6.3 million, followed by 2.8, and we saw those coming in the summertime, but we still continue to tax up to the cap, that it would be nice if we could look at some tax relief even. I know we're trying to support programs, but using the fund for a little bit. Not all of it, cut spending as well, but that would be my suggestion. Thank you.
And it's certainly one of the priorities that we discussed in the presentation as well.
All right, thank you.
Hi, I'm Mary Ann Dunn. So I just wanted to touch back on the kindergarten TA topic and say that maintaining that support at the primary grades is so vital and I think really affects the longitudinal progress of our students and can really impact, how much extra support some students will need later on. So the impact of those TAs, it may seem like, oh, but they'll still be there for 2 hours. They were already reduced just a few years ago, and I think it would be such a lack of respect for the work that they do to continue to reduce them. The other question I have is, even though it was only employees that remarked and really set a priority for class size, everyone wanted to support students. So in looking at class sizes, would that be a way to then meet the need of supporting at-risk students and students with disabilities, across all grade levels?
I'm sorry if there was a question. I'm sorry I missed it.
No, that's okay. I was wondering if looking at class size could be one of the ways to address meeting the needs of students learning by reducing, even, at the high school level, reducing by a few students, you could really then reduce those ratios to improve overall progress. Is that something
Well,
that...
we absolutely do look at class size. The ways that we think about meeting the needs of students at the high school level, for example, co-teachers in 9th and 10th, and next year we're hopeful to move to 11th grade, have, for the most part, in the low 20s, sometimes less, of students, so that they have opportunities to get a lot of attention from classroom teachers. The vast majority of our elementary classrooms, I know there's one notable exception at Pine Bush, are very much in the low 20s. Some of them, many of them are in the teens. Trying district-wide to maintain that low class size. We have had an eye on the middle school for years. Those class sizes, they're better now than they were a few years ago when they were averaging in the high 20s. We're now in the mid 20s. The challenge with just lowering class size dramatically is that it's a very, very expensive proposition that whether or not we can sustain over time, becomes a difficult question. But we are very cognizant of class size when all is said and done.
Thank you.
When I look, my name's Erica Smith. I have a son and daughter at Pine Bush. I worked at BOCES for a long time, and looking at the students with disability that will be exiting out or returning to district. When you send a student to BOCES, that's a really big decision that the CSC makes, because it's very expensive. So also to make that determination to send a student out of their home school, it's very expensive, and to take them out of the mainstream environment. So it makes me concerned when I look at the cuts that you're thinking about making, especially to TAs, and maybe changing of class sizes and all that. Are we prepared to take on that responsibility? Or are we going to be really ready to bring those kids back into district and support them in the least restrictive environment and giving them the free appropriate education that they deserve at the level that they're going to require? Because even now what we're seeing in district with kids that we have, they're struggling. As you can see, we have a lot of concerns in those surveys giving the kids the social and emotional support. Students with disabilities are struggling. The teachers are reporting that they need the help. The parents are reporting they need the help. So now you're saving $450,000, but you see that's a need in the district. And to bring kids that are really in need back, that's a concern I have. I've worked with those kids. I know the need that they have. It's a really big concern. And they need a lot of specialized care sometimes. So that's something that really needs to be considered. And the education that goes into training teachers and TAs to really support them in the least restrictive environment.
What's that? I don't know. Do you want to ask her to?
Damien, is anybody going to speak to that concern? Or
Was it a question or more just a...
It is, like, is it truly being thought about? Because I'm struggling getting a speech and language evaluation for my son, who already has an IEP. So I could only imagine what's going to happen if other parents with more are going to really struggle, and how are you even going to get those other concerns? So is it really being thought about it, or are you looking at just the bottom line? And you need to think about it more than a kid is just a dollar sign. These are real kids. These are real, like, we're getting them ready to go out into the world. And I see a lot of things on here for sports. And yes, sports are great, extracurriculars are great, but some of these kids that we're talking about, especially with students with disabilities, this education is what they're going to get to just go out in the world to get a job. And I know fundraising can happen for sports equipment. And that's going to teach those kids that have those regular abilities to go out and really put in that extra effort to get those sports equipment. So as we think about that, and you guys can discuss that later or whatever, but to really put that to thought.
I just didn't know if we have all these administrators that are here today would be able to speak to kind of the rationale as to why these items might appear on the list,
Right.
just to give some clarity, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, first off, this one's on, right? Yes. Lisa and Kelly are in the back of the room, but I'll chime in a little bit on that. I think it's important to note that a decision around placement cannot be made for budget purposes. A decision around placement is made by a CSE. So the recommendations are connected to CSE decisions that have been made. The specific students that we're talking about, I'd have to defer to Lisa and Kelly about that, but I think we have to be clear that decisions around placement are not made for the purpose of budget. These are savings that have emerged because of placement decisions made by CSEs.
Sorry, because I know you're in the process of answering this still, but as a person who has been sitting in multiple CSE meetings, and my phone has already started ringing 2 months ago for CSE meetings coming up, I can assure you that in these CSE meetings, some of these kids are not getting what they're supposed to get. And it's a hard decision, and I get it, and I understand it, because there are a lot of different things, and I understand least restrictive environment. I understand, well, they might be proficient, or they may be 1 or 2 points to where they're supposed to be, but no, that doesn't work that way. And actually, I'm going to kind of piggyback rate on Erica's question, because my concern with the same thing with the 450,000 is the cap and expense-based aid that's proposed, the 2% cap. I'm wondering if maybe this has anything to do with why some of these kids are coming back in, because I do have the same concern, that, which I'm hoping that it doesn't pass, because it should be something, I believe, in maybe 2000. I'm not even going to get into it, but I'm just crossing my fingers. But if they're coming back just because of the possibility of a cap, or because it makes it easier, if they were in these places already, then I'm with her, where I'm really nervous that they're not going to get the supports they need, because there are kids, like it or not, in this district, and I know everyone's trying their hardest, but I'm going to say it, and I've said it last year, that are not getting what they need for services. They are not getting it. You can sit there left and right, front and center, show me any piece of paper and tell me that they are. You do not spend hours upon hours and get texts at 2, 3 in the morning from parents who can't sleep, which I do, because my kid isn't getting this, I asked for this, I asked for that, and you try to talk them through the way that they're supposed to, not the backwards I'm going to yell, but the actual this is what the procedures are, and they're still not getting what they need.
Neil, can you address the cap on the excess cost aid piece?
Yes, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later during the board meeting, but there is a proposal as part of the executive budget proposal to take summer tuition costs for students with disabilities and reduce the aid ratio that's associated with that. So for a long time now, we've been reimbursed at 80% of our costs for tuition for those kids attending summer programs, students with disabilities. It's going to go to, the proposal is to have it go to our wealth-based measure or index, which would bring it down to about 47% reimbursement. So we're looking at the potential of maybe, if this proposal were to go through, of a loss of revenue state aid of $175,000. So that's where we are at the moment.
I'm going to give you one plus. Because of the conferences I sat in this weekend, it's statewide, it's not just us.
Correct.
But the cap is on summer school, or the change is on summer school. It's not on your costs associated with servicing students with disabilities. Just to clarify, because Kim, I think when you and I spoke about this a couple weeks ago, I might have been unclear, thinking it covered all excess cost aid, and it does not.
No, that I knew when you had mentioned that as well.
Okay.
I knew that ahead of time when we spoke, just being at my ECB meeting, because most of this stuff, when you were talking about that, because I sit on the ECB as well, I had already known what that is. And this weekend we had many conversations with Commissioner Elia, and we were talking about essentially the roughly 80 to 50% where it's across the board for special ed. So I was aware of that.
Okay, good.
So I have a question about the world language program in the kindergarten school. So is there any plan like for Chinese, open Chinese program in kindergarten school? Can you hear me?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch any of that.
Okay, so I have a question about the world language program in kindergarten school. So I want to know if is there any program, is there any plan that we can open Chinese program in kindergarten school?
Like a Chinese language program?
Yeah, Chinese language program. Yeah.
Maria, I'll jump in. I don't want to cut you off, but no, at this point in time, we are not planning to offer Chinese. We've discussed it at length a number of times. It has come up. We currently offer 4 languages, but at this point in time, we're not looking for Chinese.
Okay, thank you.
I just was hoping that maybe somebody could talk a little bit more about the middle school 8th grade class section changes that are proposed. I mean, as I read it, it sounds like, I mean, we would lose, our FTEs, but I just was hoping that someone could say what they think the pluses and minuses of that are, because it sounds very reasonable, but I'm sure there's some kind of a drawback there.
Should bring Mike Laster up to talk about
He's
that.
coming up. He's coming up.
Good evening. Thank you. Basically, it's an enrollment-driven decision. Right now, at the 8th grade level, we have 16 homeroom sections. Next year, when that bubble leaves, we are looking at the enrollment that's coming in from the elementary schools, and we're able to sustain this current class size with 14, 14, 14. Ideally, we'd love to move to a 16, 16, 16 model. However, right now, the difficult fiscal situation that the district in, prohibits us from doing that. So one of the benefits is we won't have half-time teachers. Right now we have half-time teachers who, it's really difficult and presents challenges for students to access them every other day. So instead, we'd rather have full-time teachers who are there every single day so that all students have an equitable experience across all the houses. So it was a difficult decision, but it's one that helps us meet our 2% goal. So thank you for the question.
Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Okay. Dr. Wiles, do you want to wrap this portion up?
I want to say this, these proposals are available on our website, and there is a text box under each group where you can send an email with your specific comments or questions or concerns in each of those categories. Each year we put together a frequently asked question document based on some of the things that we hear from the community. So please take the continued opportunity to visit the website and give us your feedback. So the next step in the budget development process is going to be very heavily underway beginning next week, really, during the break. We will have the first draft of the budget ready for presentation on March 6th. So if you have additional feedback that you would like us to take into consideration, please don't hesitate to go on, share your thoughts. And then I read all of the comments that are there so far today and would love to see more commentary. We do read and take all of those things into consideration when we're coming to the decision points that will make the first draft of the budget. The other thing I'll say is we release the budget on March 6th. It is not the end. It is the beginning of the budget process. So I think, pride ourselves on being very willing to hear your feedback and to respond to it to the best of our ability. So please don't hold back in sharing your comments and sending us your questions. And for everyone who came tonight, I just want to say thank you so much.